Let's talk about VPC endpoint. Let's first understand why we need VPC endpoint, and then we'll see implementation details of them. Hopefully by this time you have a better understanding of this architecture. We have a VPC setup. There are instances running, net gateway, internet gateway, all set up. Now, the services which run inside VPC are less in number. What I mean by that, so if I put some of the services which are available to be running inside VPC is Amazon EC2, like we have EC2 instances. Another service we use within VPC is called your Amazon RDS, relational database services. Then you may set up your Amazon EMR cluster inside it. Maybe you want to run your Amazon Elasticache service here. So these services, or maybe container based services, these services requires a VPC to operate. On the other hand, services do not require VPC, which you can think runs outside of VPC. And this list of services are huge. These services include things like Amazon S3, you have Amazon DynamoDB, then you have CloudWatch as a service, maybe you want to talk to Athena as a service. All these services run outside of VPC. So how communication would happen? Let's see that. So these are my services outside of VPC, which are listed here, some of them. Now, they are still within the same region. Let's consider my machine here, which is F, has to store some data into S3 bucket here in the same region. Now, these services which are outside of VPC, they all have a public endpoint. Public endpoint means they have a DNS name on which you connect, and that is only accessible by default if you are coming from a public network. So what happens now? F has to communicate to S3. So request from F will go through internet gateway, will be sent over internet connection, and then it will flow down to your service here into Amazon S3. Now, if machine G here has to communicate to CloudWatch, how the request will go? G is in private subnet, so it can't directly access internet. So its request will be forwarded through this net gateway. Through net gateway, the request will go to internet, and from internet, it would be then coming to the service here, CloudWatch. So you could see it is a very long path you have to take. You want to meet your next door neighbor, but you go outside of the city and then come back and then go to them. That is not fair. We want a better way to connect them, and that is where endpoints comes into picture. Once you set up an endpoint would establish a private connectivity like this. So once the endpoint is established, consider like if this was one house and this was second house, you have to communicate to them, and for that you have to go all over the city and then come back. Now instead of this, we have set up a backyard door, and through this you should be able to communicate and meet that person. Shouldn't be a problem. So that's what we are trying to do here through something called endpoint, and these endpoint will keep your traffic private. They won't send traffic outside to internet, so it will save you cost and it will save you time and give you better performance, because your traffic is not going outside. Internally it is communicating, and it is much secure because you are not exposing your traffic at all to internet. Now, these endpoints are of two types. One is called a gateway endpoint and another is called an interface endpoint. Gateway endpoint is only for two specific services which are named DynamoDB and Amazon S3. On the other hand, interface endpoint is available for all other supported services which are having endpoints available. So let me go ahead to console and show this thing. That would be much easier for you to follow along. Let's go to management console and we'll see how these endpoints actually work. So I'll go to VPC and there I would explore the available endpoints which are there. Here is my endpoint options, right? So I'm going here on endpoints, and through this endpoint, I should be able to set up a endpoint. I do not have any endpoint as of now. That's completely fine. Let me click on create endpoint. When I say it asks me to give a name. Now, endpoint can be mostly used to talk to AWS services, But if you want, they can talk to private link marketplace services and other endpoint services. For our discussion, I'm just focusing on AWS services as of now. And if you see the list, there are 203 endpoints which I could use. And here I could see the list of type, owner, who has provided that. And if I try to sort it out, I sorted it by the type and I only see gateway for these two, which is COM, Amazon AWS US East 1 DynamoDB, which is a gateway endpoint, and COM Amazon AWS US East 1.s3, that is a gateway endpoint. So DynamoDB and S3 both are available only as a gateway. Remaining all other services, as you could think of, they would be part of interface endpoint. So let's say I want to talk to a service like Athena, and that would be available here. Let's see this. So Athena is an interface endpoint. I want to talk to Cloud Watch as a service. Now that is called a log service. So here I have a logs which I would be connecting to service catalog, and maybe this one is my log service which I could connect to. I am looking for connecting to systems manager, and that is called SSM. So naming will be a little different, as you could see here. SSM service can be connected through a interface endpoint, and see this. A service may have its additional endpoint, like if you are just trying to use SSM, this is good. If you are trying to use some context, then this will require incident SSM messages. So a service may have multiple endpoint. So the list here which we are getting, it is not like 203 services. I would say it may be list of component within those services also. So let's keep it very simple. I want to establish one connectivity to S3, and maybe another one I want to set up with Athena. Athena is a query service by which you could query data. We won't use that service here, but I'm just trying to establish a connectivity to that service. Let me first set up a S3 endpoint, and I am selecting S3 as a gateway endpoint. So I selected S3 as a gateway endpoint for US East 1, the region which I am in right now, and then I have to say which VPC it would get associated with. So I do not have additional VPC, I have just my default VPC, that is still fine. I would go ahead and set up a VPC here. Now, as soon as I go ahead and say I want to have an endpoint, gateway endpoint requires a entry into route table. The idea here is, as soon as the traffic will be generated which is destined for Amazon S3 service, it would be forwarded through routing table to the endpoint. So we have to add entry of this endpoint into a route table of that VPC. I have only one route table, default VPC route table, so I would just add entry there. Let me show this route table first, and once I add the entry, I would again show you that how it looks like. So it will give you idea that what changes would happen in your route table. So current my route table is default route table. If I go to the routes associated with it, I have a 00 route which is going to IGW, which means we have public internet connection, and then this one is the internal IP address range of the VPC that is also accessible, and these two entry only exist. I'll go here and I would say I want to add entry into route table. Now if you see, this is a checkbox. So there are chances that you may have multiple route table within your VPC. One may be for private, maybe another one for VPN, maybe another one for some other communication. So you could add this entry into multiple endpoints, multiple route table shouldn't be a problem at all. I am just adding it into the default route table. This entry can be protected through a policy which is called VPC Endpoint policy. This is a document in which I would specify who is allowed to access this endpoint. For sake of this demo, I'm just using it as a full access. Otherwise, I could have customized it, and there are tools available to help you dictate and create your own policy. Right now, I am keeping it simple, but this VPC endpoint are protected by the policy which can be provided here. I am keeping this thing simple, and now I say, let me create an endpoint. So when I'm creating an endpoint, what is going to happen? I got a endpoint ID. I got which VPC it is associated. Let me rename it. So I would say it will be a S3 gateway endpoint. So this is much easier for me to identify. And this should have added its entry into the default route table as per the configuration I have done inside. So this is my default route table in which entry should have been made now. And if I go to my route table again, let me refresh it, and sometimes it may take little bit of time to show up here, but it should be there. Like currently it is not displayed. We'll give it few seconds and refresh it again. Hopefully this time the entry would be there. So give it few seconds and it should be there. I'm pausing the video and I'll talk to you again in few seconds. Okay, by the magic of pause and resume, I'm back. And if I see now, I refresh it and I get an entry here into the route table which we selected, which says PL dash some number, and its target is VPCE and a number. VPCE stands for VPC endpoint. So where is S3 mentioned? How I would know that it has to send traffic only for S3? So that is done by here. This is called prefix list. This is represented by PL. What basically this prefix list is? This prefix list contains all the IP addresses which Amazon S3 is currently responding on. So if I go into this prefix list and I check its entries, this is the list of IP address on which Amazon S3 service is running. So as soon as your packet would want to talk to Amazon S3 as a service, it would reach out to any of these IP address range, and route table would know that, okay, you are going to S3 and let me forward your traffic to the endpoint rather than sending you to the public network. So this prefix list is there. You could create your own prefix list for some other services or some other type of traffic, but this list is maintained by AWS. And if let's say they later add more IP address or range for Amazon S3, prefix list will automatically get updated. You do not have to manually do anything. So because of this, what happened now, I have a endpoint created, and that endpoint will be forwarding my traffic to Amazon S3 service, and that is through a route table. So how this gateway endpoint works? Gateway endpoint adds an entry into routing table by which your traffic will be redirected to the endpoint, and then it will reach to the service. This may not be very efficient design if you have hundreds of services to talk to, because if your route table keeps on going longer and longer and longer, it may take time for routers to decide how to forward the packet, and that's why they have to come up with a better approach, because the services keeps on growing, and the better approach they have come up with is called your interface endpoint. So I hope this thing is clear. What is a gateway endpoint? And now let me focus on endpoint, which will be my interface endpoint. I don't know why the name was not saved, but let me click again and let's call it S3 gateway endpoint. And I say save. Hopefully this time it will be saved. Let me refresh it again. Nope. Not sure what I'm doing wrong here. S3 gateway endpoint. Maybe a glitch in the system. So I'll leave it as of now. Probably in some time it would get fixed or it should start reflecting. Okay. So second endpoint I'm interested in creating is Athena endpoint. I want to talk to a service which is, let's say, called Athena. So I'm searching for the service Athena, and I should be able to see various options available for it. So sorry, not this. This is the name I have given, Athena, and this is my interface endpoint. I would search for the service here, Athena, and here is the service, AWS .us east.athena, and I say, okay, I want to talk to you. Now in this case, I have to select again a VPC. This is my VPC, but I have to add additional setting here that on which specific subnet I want this interface endpoint to be available. And you could set up it to be available in all the subnet, or you could be selective if the need be. So I could say, hey, I want it to be available in all the subnet, no problem. So I could select it, all the availability zone, and then select specific subnet within that availability zone. Like I have this default VPC, which has 6 subnet, and I am putting it on all 6 subnet. But if I feel no, I would only be needing it for 1A and 1B, let me just add it here. Don't unnecessarily add it unless you know what you are doing. Right? Once this thing is set up, what I would be having a IP address on this. Plus, This is doing what? Let me try to draw that. Behind the scene, if this is my subnet I am representing, in this subnet, it is setting up a network interface, or we can call it a ENI. And this ENI would have IP address. So if there are machines here in this subnet, and now they say, hey, we want to send traffic to Athena, what would happen? This ENI would be listening to the request which is coming up, which is going to Athena as a service, and then forward it through internal mechanism to the service, which is your Athena service. Right. So for interface endpoints, ENI is provisioned into the subnet of your choice. You select which subnet you want that connectivity to, and then we would establish a network interface on it, and it will take IP. So whatever your IP address range was available within that subnet, one of the IP would be consumed. And this one is made highly available by design. AWS takes care of its availability, so you do not have to worry. You just select which subnet you want it. Most probably you would keep it into multiple subnet in multiple AZs, so that even if one AZ fails, you would still have connectivity. Right. So this would be using what? If this is a ENI, it would also be protected using a security group. We remember security group, right? Security group is associated on a ENI level, and if this is a ENI, we could protect this also through a security group, like my VPC um, gateway endpoint. We protected through a policy, but here in case of interface endpoint, we will protect it by a security group. So hopefully this thing is clear, and let's see what happens. This won't add any entry into route table. I have just selected these two, and I would say which security group to associate. I'm using default, but probably you would have your own way of doing things. Policy can still be applied here if there need be, no issues at all on that. And then you could put some tag and say create an endpoint. So this endpoint got created, and now it would forward my traffic as soon as it comes for Athena through this network endpoint to service Athena, so that I do not have to send traffic outside. This one is your interface endpoint, and later if you have more subnets to be added, you could, should not be a problem at all. It has not added any entry into routing table. Let me quickly go through that route table just to show you and verify that it is not adding any entry into route tables. I will go to routes, and here only the entry is for routes. Right. Now, sometimes people call it that gateway endpoint are network layer. I would say yes, they are network layer. Why? Or they operate at network layer because they are operating through the route table entry, and route table is a network layer entity which works on IP addresses, whereas your interface endpoint are referred as a application layer service because it would intercept the packet which are going to Athena in the destination, and then we would be forwarding that to the required service. So you could call it that gateway endpoint is your network layer service, whereas your interface endpoint is a application layer service, but it is not an official answer. Right. So hopefully this thing is clear, and we establish connectivity. So let's go to slides and see how this thing works. Hopefully you have idea on that both. I have to talk one more thing here. S3 is now available in this channel too. So S3 is accessible through a interface endpoint, plus it is accessible through a gateway endpoint. This is a new setting which has been made available. Let me show that quickly here also. So I again go to my endpoints, and this time I want to create an endpoint. This is going to be talking to a service, and let me search services here S3 and see this. So this is my S3 service, and S3 has both type of endpoint available for gateway also and interface also. So you decide what works well for you. You may use any of them and it would do the same thing for you. Right. So difference between these two endpoints, let's go ahead to a tabular format. And by the way, you could get a better picture representation of this in this link, which I would be having into resource section. Here are more details on it, how it works. And here is a pictorial representation of how it is actually working. So this is my region. If I am talking to DynamoDB and S3, I am using Gateway VPC endpoint, which is associated on a VPC level. But if I am talking to other services, then I am using interface endpoint, and they create a network interface within the subnet, and these are called my interface endpoint. So interface endpoint are at subnet level, whereas VPC and gateway endpoint are at the VPC level. That is one more distinction between them. So check this picture. This is giving you a better idea on how this is actually communicating with the internal services. So differences here. Both are used for private connectivity, but gateway endpoint, private connectivity to S3 and DynamoDB. Interface endpoint, 100 plus AWS services, including Amazon S3. How gateway endpoint works? Gateway endpoint adds an entry into route table for a prefix list, and then your traffic is routed. In an interface endpoint, an ENI or multiple ENI is provisioned in the selected subnet, which serve as an entry point for traffic destined to the supported service. Behind the scene, AWS is using a service which is called private link. So private link is allowing that private connectivity, establishing a link privately from your subnet up to that particular service. Now, one thing you have to be clear here, why I'm saying ENIs here. Let's say this is my subnet and I have a EC2 machine running here. I want this EC to talk to a service like Athena. I want it to talk to, let's say, S3 also. Let me put it here completely that I am referencing S3 interface endpoint, and I want it also to talk to CloudWatch. So in this particular case, what is going to happen? We would have three ENIs created, 1, 2, and 3. One ENI which will be for Athena, another ENI which will be for S3, and another one which will be for CloudWatch. So that's why you may have multiple ENI and you are not having one ENI for all services. Every service would provision its own ENI, which would consume IP addresses in your subnet. So be aware that you would be needing sufficient IP addresses if you are trying to talk to multiple AWS services. Okay. So these are powered by private link. Gateway endpoint is provisioned at VPC level. We saw that. And the entry is added to the route table. Interface endpoint are added at subnet level. No entry required in the route table for it. No need for making any changes there. Plus, from security perspective, gateway endpoint gives you a VPC endpoint policy. Interface endpoint gives you security groups plus VPC endpoint policy. So you decide on how you want to protect these two services. So I hope this thing is clear and you got a better idea on how this endpoint works. So they will save you cost, they will keep your performance up, and they will give you a better security. So please use endpoint for your services. It is very common to have questions in exam which will give you a scenario and say that, hey, I want a private connectivity to the service, what I should do. Should I use an interface endpoint or a gateway endpoint? Now, if you are confused that if in question they ask you about S3 and they say, hey, should you use gateway or should you use interface? I would say probably these type of confusing questions won't be there, but even if you select gateway or interface, both should be correct answer. So I don't see a problem in these type of question. Probably it won't be there, but just in case it exists, interface endpoint, I would personally go with. Now, one thing to be aware for exam that let's say a technology got released today or a feature got released today, it's not going to show up into your exam next day. It takes minimum of 6 months, and I would say more than some time than 6 months to actually show up a question on the recent technologies. So don't worry about changes happening in AWS world every day. If you are preparing for certification, you would still have 6 months or more time required for those questions to show up into your actual exam. To summarize this, I have given a service summary card here for private link. So read this information because private link is not only for AWS services, it can help you to get access through third-party services also. Or if you are a software as a service provider in AWS, you could also expose your services through private link so your customer can connect to it internally rather than sending traffic through public internet. So read this information about private link. So I hope you are enjoying. I'll talk to you into the next section. Thank you.